Hi, and welcome to my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. My name is Meng, I'm from Design Plus Code, and this is the app that we're going to learn how to build from scratch. I'm going to teach you everything that I have learned over the past 2.5 years working with swiftUI, publishing an app, and building a bunch of courses. So this UI right here is using a custom navbar and a custom tab bar. You can see that it's all animated and functional. This course is great for both designers learning code and for developers learning design and challenging UI technique. So here we have a tab view, for example, that is using pagination, and you can scroll, and we have some parallax effects and the blur, as well as the new material sheet in iOS 15 where you can customize with foreground style and background. Then we'll learn how to create a custom transition using a match geometry effect. Now we're going to detect the scrolling position and apply some more parallax here. And this is using data, so we're going to learn how to loop, how to customize the new list options in iOS 15, how to animate these outlines using progress view. Then we'll want to navigate to subsections, and you can see it's all scrollable, and I can go back, can go to another section with completely different data and come back, as well as going back to the main screen. Now we can also decide to go to another screen and then swipe from the left to create this beautiful transition with gesture, and then at a maximum distance it's going to transition back. Now let's take a look at the login experience. I'm going to tap on the profile icon here, and we have a modal. So this is completely custom, fully animated, and we have this blue circle that follows where you tap. You can also switch between sign in and sign up. And when you log in, everything dismisses, and now you're fully logged in. And then we have a account view where we're going to learn how to create graphics using the new canvas in iOS 15. So this is a blob animation with the new SF symbol 3, where we're going to learn how to change the different styles, the new symbol variant, as well as the rendering mode, so you can customize even more with a larger library of icons provided by Apple. We're going to learn how to create a light mode version, because when you're working with a lot of shadows and animations, you might want to give the option to your users to have a light mode without all of those things. And it's also great for accessibility. Then we'll learn how to work with concurrency. So all of this data is generated from an API, and it's so easy now to work with async await instead of using a lot of closures. All the techniques that we learn in this course will prepare you for adaptiveness. We're going to learn the best ways to create something in the least amount of code possible and as readable as possible. And you can see when I change to dark mode, everything just works beautifully, because we learn how to work well with colors, so the assets catalog, as well as the primary, secondary colors that goes really well with the material sheets. And because I consider myself a designer first, a lot of these UI details will not be skipped. You can see that it's pretty functional, and it's going to teach you a lot of the essential techniques to create a production-ready app. But at the same time, we're going to have a lot of fun with the animations, with the different techniques, and most importantly, we're going to make sure that every step of the way is going to be easy to understand and easy to learn for anyone of any skill level. So as long as you have some coding experience, you know how to use a computer, how to code some basic HTML and CSS, or you have done swiftUI or Swift in the past, this course is for you. So I hope you are as excited as I am to get started, because we have a lot of content. We have over 60 videos across 3 parts of this series. We're going to start from step 1, from the design tool, where we have all of the screens all layered with components as well as the design system. So we have the colors, the dynamic type, and all of the assets, including the app icon where I prepared this template. I'm going to show you how to export and then import to Xcode, as well as the assets when we're going to start building the app. So all of these files are available to download at the bottom of this page or every page in this course. And here you can find all the assets that you can just drag and drop to Xcode and skip the importing process for the app icon and so forth. You have the Figma file, and then you have the images as you would have if you were creating your project from scratch. So you're going to have different types of images, and we're going to learn how to import them one by one. Now, at any point, you can compare your progress against what we have in the course, or you can see what is the final project that I have shown you so far in the first minutes of this video. The first thing you need to do is to head to the App Store and find the app called Xcode. And here we are at the 13 version, so Xcode 13. You're going to install that and then open it. Keep in mind that Xcode 13 only works for macOS Big Sur or later, and in this case I have Monterey, and when you have Monterey you can only have Xcode 13, you cannot go back to Xcode 12. Once you have Xcode 13 installed, it's going to ask you to install a bunch of components. You're going to do that, and then when you open it again, you're going to see this dialog where you're going to create, for some of you, your very first Xcode project. So let's tap that, and here we're going to see this dialog here. We're going to tap on iOS and then app, click on next. Then we're going to name the project. In this case, it's going to be Design Code iOS 15. For the team, we're going to deal with that later, but essentially, if you want to be able to test on your device, you're going to need to have a developer account. It can be free, and it's going to allow you to set up some certificates, and you're going to be able to test on your device. But otherwise, you do not need that. For now, you can always use the iOS simulator. For the organization identifier, it's going to be your domain name in reverse. So for example, com.apple, com.twitter. In my case, it's going to be io.designcode. And with these two combined, it's going to give you the unique bundle identifier. For the interface, we're going to select swiftUI, the language Swift, and then we're going to tap on next. So here we're going to save our project, and typically you're going to save that in downloads, but you can save that pretty much anywhere you want, and we're going to create. And there you go. This is your project in Xcode 13. So the first thing we want to do is to resume so that we can start showing the UI preview for what you have in code right here. Now at the beginning, we're not going to write any code. We're just going to explore the UI of Xcode 13. So this might take some time to load for the first time. And also, if you want to change this device to preview, you're going to want to go to this list right here. And typically you want to start with, let's say, iPhone 13. Anytime that you change the device, you might want to resume, and you're going to see the new device. And anytime you change the code, it's going to also show the preview in real time. Now let's talk about the Xcode UI. First of all, just like in the design tool, you have the navigator in the left and the inspector in the right. The inspector allows you to change the options based on what you have selected, and the navigator is where you're going to find your project files, such as the different views and the assets. Now, it is important to understand that we have different tabs for the left side. So here, the first tab is the most important. It's called the Project Navigator. And in the right side as well, we have different tabs. And the most important one is called the Attributes Inspector. Make sure to always go back to those tabs. Sometimes Xcode will automatically switch. For example, when you have a crash or when you have some issues, it might switch to these other tabs, which is why it's important to be familiar with the main tabs. At any time, you can decide to hide the left part as well as the right part to save some screen real estate. Now I'm going to show it back. And here in the middle part, we have the code editor. And then on the right side, we have the preview where you're going to have a lot of options. Again, we're going to explore these things later. Now, if you want to run the app in the iOS simulator, which is a simulation of what you would see on your device, it's very accurate. You can do so by clicking on play, but we're going to do this mostly later, and we're going to be mostly using the preview for the time being. And here we have the project, we have the device, we have the status, and we can insert elements by clicking on the plus sign. But before we start building, we're going to need to set up our project. First of all, if you want to go to project settings, we're going to tap on design code iOS 15. And this is where you can change the display name, for example. I'm not going to get into the other things. I don't think they are important for the moment. But let's say we want to change to just design code. And the second thing is you want to make sure that your development is going to target iOS 15 because this is an iOS 15 course. And also, if you don't target iOS 15, it's going to set up all of these conditions that might put off some beginners who have not done iOS development in the past. So make sure to set the deployment target for iOS 15 for now. Next, we're going to go to the assets catalog. And this is where you can set the accent color for your app, as well as the app icon. And we can also drag and drop some images that we have from the project. The next part is optional. I will be showing you how to import the images one by one, how to set up the color sets, and how to work with Figma. Now, if you don't want to follow that, you can just go to the assets folder, double click on it, select all, so using Command A in your keyboard, and then drag and drop the entire thing. But before you do that, make sure to delete these two, so accent color and app icon. Now we're going to go back to the folder and drag and drop the entire thing. Once you have this done, then you have all your assets set up. From here, you can just move to the next section. So this part is optional because you can just drag and drop all the assets that are prepared for you. But let me explain how I prepare my assets. First of all, you want to set up your colors and then your dynamic type when you design, so you can just apply to the correct element, and it's going to be very consistent. It's going to be easy to translate to swiftUI as well. For the complex assets, you want to make sure that you export them in PNG and that they are at least scale at 3x, because we have the Super Retina display, which is with the 3x pixel density. Now, this is not for UI, because for most UIs it's going to be done in swiftUI, but for these images, they need to be scaled, so you don't need to export necessarily to 1x, 2x, and 3x, because you just need to set a single universal size. For something that is not complex with just a few shapes, and you want to be able to scale infinitely and it's going to keep the sharpness, you can use either the PDF or the SVG format. Now the PDF is a little bit more well-versed in iOS versus the SVG, which is a little bit more limited. But again, depending on what image that you have, your mileage may vary. Now for the app icon, you want to set all the resolutions. Unfortunately, you can't just set one resolution, it's going to scale. Now for now, you're going to need to set them one by one. One trick that I do is that I set a component here, and then from this component, I just resize them one by one and just set the frame name and export everything like this. Once you have all your assets, let me just reset the way it was before, and we're going to follow each step. So in a typical project, you're going to have the images folder where you have the app icon prepared and the different images that you have exported from Figma or any design tool. For the app icon, we're going to tap on app icon. Then we're going to go to the app icon folder, and then we're going to find only the iPhone files first. So let's select all of them at the bottom, starting with the iPhone 20 at 2x, and drag and drop right here. So this takes care of the iPhone app icons. So next, we're going to set the bigger one, so the app icon beta. And then finally, we're going to do the iPad. So starting with the first one in order, I'm going to skip this part, which is just to drag and drop one by one. There you go. I'm going to drag and drop the last one. Next, we're going to talk about the accent color. What is the accent color? Well, it's one color that's going to apply to all your text buttons, UI buttons, sidebar, and so on. To set it up, I'm going to select it, and there's just one important thing that you need to know. First of all, we're going to go to the design tool, and we're going to find the colors in iOS, and this is where you're going to see that we have colors prepared for both light and dark mode. Typically, the light mode is a little bit darker, so it's more readable, and the dark mode is going to be lighter, again, for better contrast. And so for the accent color, we're going to set this color right here. We're going to copy the hex value, and typically that's what designers use. And so we're going to go back here, and in Xcode, we're going to set the appearances to any dark. So now we have two versions, one for light mode and the other one for dark mode. Let's set the light mode first. I'm going to go to the color content, and here you can set to P3, which is the new devices such as the iPhone and the new monitors that Apple use, or sRGB, and this depends on how you set it up in Figma as well. Now for the input method, I'm going to set to 8-bit hex, and this is where I'm going to paste the value that I got from Figma and press enter. And there you go. I'm going to do the same thing for dark mode. And again, I'm going to use sRGB, hex, go back to Figma, and then get the color value. Now we're going to create more colors for the background and for the shadow. And you can create as many color sets as you want. It's going to really help your implementation, especially if you want to adapt for dark mode. To create a new color set, we're going to right click here and click on new color set. And we're going to name that background. Then you will repeat the same steps. So you're going to be taking the colors from Figma, and once you're done, you should have something like this. Now you want to organize your images and your colors. So what you can do is select these two colors, right click on it, and click on new folder from selection. We can name this colors. Then for the rest of the images, so we have done the app icon so far. We have also created the colors manually, and then we just need to drag and drop the rest of the images. So like this. And that's it. You should have all your assets right here. If you had trouble with any of the steps, you can always download the Xcode project provided in the assets files from the previous section. And in this case, we have set up the project. Then we're going to go back to content view, click on resume, and here we can start building the UI. Now, please keep in mind that anytime that you have a problem with Xcode, you have a build problem, and sometimes you don't know what to do, you can always do Command-Shift-K to clean your build, Command-B to build again, or worst case scenario, you can restart Xcode, which works like magic. Now that we have the setup out of the way, we can finally start building the UI based on the design that we have, the animations, the fun stuff that we want to build. So to get started, I'll see you in the next section. Hi, and welcome to the second section of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to learn about the visual editor in swiftUI inside Xcode 13. Now we're not going to write any code today, and we're only going to drag and drop a bunch of things as well as editing things. Just like in the design tool, we will edit in the inspector. The design that we'll be implementing is the home screen. So if I select this in Figma, Shift 2, it's going to zoom in. And so we're going to implement this simple layout in swiftUI. Back in Xcode, you can see that we have a text element, and this is clickable from here and also from the preview. If you see this little rectangle, that means it's selected. You can also see the bounding box as well as the size right here. And this preview, you can zoom in, you can zoom out. Typically you work at 100%. And finally, we're going to change the content and the options in the inspector. Make sure to be in the attributes inspector. So if you want to change the content, we can write swiftUI for iOS 15 and press enter. So the text here is an element, just like in Figma you have a text, a rectangle, etc. And then you have the modifiers, which are kind of like CSS properties on steroids, because you can do so many things in terms of coding and functionalities on top of the styling itself. But today we're going to focus on the styling, so we're going to look at the font specifically. And if you select the font, you're going to see that we have a bunch of preset styles, such as body, caption, and we call this dynamic type. If you go to the human interface guideline for iOS, and in visual design typography, you're going to scroll and you're going to learn a lot about the fonts that Apple use for their platform. Specifically, we're using SF Pro, which is for iOS and iPadOS and macOS. So if you look at the fonts that you can download from Apple, you can download these fonts that you can use in Figma, and also you're going to be able to go to font book and it's going to appear on this list right here. So you can use that in any design tool that you want. You can preview it and you can use it pretty much anywhere, as long as it's part of the Apple ecosystem. So we're talking about the 5 main platform, which is the iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, tvOS, and macOS. Now we have 5 fonts, but the one that we're really using today is just the SF Pro, and the SF Compact is for watchOS, which is more readable for a smaller screen. SF Mono, typically used for code, because every single character is really well spaced and consistently spaced. So this is great for code highlighting, for example. And then we have Arabic as well as New York, which is more for traditional UI such as news. Another thing that is really helpful when you're designing for iOS is the Apple Design Resources, where you can find the design templates directly from Apple, and typically they include the fonts as well. So with this out of the way, we're going to go back to dynamic type, and we're going to learn a little bit about what it means. So for both designers and developers, it's really helpful to respect the main sizes, because typically in the design you have the large title and a bunch of titles, the body, and the smaller text. And here we have a design system that is already created by Apple, and it's consistent in iOS, but most importantly, it's going to adapt to the different accessibility options set by the users, meaning that it's going to scale automatically for us without having to set those sizes and set a bunch of conditions. Everything happened automatically. So what I suggest to a lot of developers and designers is to really use the dynamic type. It's going to make your life so much easier. Back to Xcode, you can see that I can select the large title, and automatically it's going to change the code as well as what is in the preview. And I can change the weight to be bold. And again, it changed the text plus the modifiers. As I explained before, the text is an element and the modifiers are like CSS properties and options based on the element itself. So here you can play with more options such as the color, the alignment, the line limit. And then let's take a look at the padding. You can see that we have set the padding by default, but just like in CSS, we can change which part of the padding we want: the top padding, the left, right, or bottom. Now, one thing to note in Swift is that left is called leading and right is called trailing. Now bottom and top is basically the same thing. And if you want to remove the padding, you can click on the X button here. It's going to remove the entire padding. Now we only have the text and 2 modifiers. Next, we're going to add a second text. So let's copy this text from Figma. We're going to go back to Xcode, and to insert a new element, you can click on the plus sign right here in the top right. This is going to call the library. And in the library, we have the first tab, which are the views, and then the modifiers. We have code snippets, the images that we have imported so far, as well as the colors that we have set earlier. We're going to go to views and we're going to search for text. Then we're going to select this one called text, drag, and you can drop it right below the first title. And boom, there you go. We have the second text. It created even the stack for us so that we can combine the two together. The stack is kind of like a container, and within that container, we can play with the spacing and the alignment, etc. So now I'm going to select the placeholder text. I'm going to paste that text that I copied from Figma and then enter. At any point in the preview, you can select the elements, but also for the stacks, you can select in between as long as the area is within the stack. Notice that every single element is going to take the minimum size. So unlike the other platforms such as CSS, which takes the maximum size, swiftUI is going to try to take the minimum size. And this is to ensure that your UI is always going to look good regardless of the screen size. It's going to center. So for example, if you have the watch screen, it's going to center and it's going to automatically wrap. For the stack, in the inspector, we have 2 options. One is the spacing. We're going to set it to 8. So now we have spacing between items. So even if you have 3 or 5 items, it's always going to set 8 between them. And then we have the alignment. By default, right now, it's center. Let's change that to the left. Let me go to the preview and select the second text. And here I'm going to set the font to footnote, as well as the weight to semi-bold. In Figma, I'm going to copy the content of the third text and go back to Xcode. And this is where I'm going to insert another text. Now, when I insert the other text, make sure to read the direction here at the bottom. And notice that sometimes it's going to insert inside the existing vertical stack, and sometimes it's going to add an additional vertical stack. So one trick is to drop directly on the second text instead. And when you do that, it's going to ensure that you're adding inside this vertical stack. Now, just like in Figma and other tools, you can always click on Command Z to go back and Command Shift Z to redo. So undo and redo, which is really helpful to go back in steps if you have made mistake, and you can always repeat the insert. Now we're going to change the text content. So we're going to go to placeholder and paste the text. Sometimes it's going to act a little bit, so you might have to double click on the blue element. So for sure, this is going to allow us to change the content. For this text element, notice that we have multiple lines. So this is where the line limit and the alignment can be really helpful. So for example, you can center the text if you want, or you can left align it. And for the line limit, you can set it to 1 and it's going to automatically create the ellipses for you, or set it to 2 and there we go. Next, we're going to click on the plus again. And by the way, we can use a keyboard shortcut for Shift, Command, and L to insert from the library. And in this case, we're going to set to the images and we're going to find a logo. So in this case, we're going to use logo 2, drag and drop. And again, we're going to drag and drop to the first title. So it's going to do that before the first title. By default, the image is going to take the original size that you have exported. You can always make it a little bit more adaptive to the content that you have. So for example, it's going to take the available space of your container. So you can do that by going to resizing stretch. And this is going to use available space that you have. In this case, since we want to take the maximum space, it's going to take the whole screen. And you can always change the aspect ratio to fill or fit. So we're going to set it to fit. And finally, we want to set the size of the image manually. And in this case, we have something called a frame. Then we can set it to 26 and then 26. Enter. So now we have this image. So the code that we have here is getting a little bit crowded. So we can always hide the left sidebar. And now we can read this a lot better. Let's select the VStack again. As you can see here, when I select this empty space, it's going to select my VStack. And I want to add a background color, but the background color is not available in these options. So I can go to the Add Modifier and I can search for background. And here I can use any modifier that's available in swiftUI and search for it. In this case, we're going to use the background and we're going to change the color to one of the preset colors from iOS, or you can use the preset colors that you have set in the assets catalog. In this case, I'm going to use, let's say, the background. Then for this container, I might want to add some padding. So let's add a 20 padding. First of all, we're going to click on the right side of this circle. This is going to add the padding for all sides. And instead of the default number, which is 16, I'm going to set it to 20. Now at any time, I can set a frame size that is fixed. So for example, I want my card to absolutely have a height of 350. I can do that by setting the frame, but also usually you want to set your content to take as much space as possible so that it's adaptive against any screen size. So I'm not going to change to a fixed width in this case. So my layout is starting to look like the design. I just forgot to set the footnote for the smaller text. So let's just do that. I'm going to select here and set it to footnote. Now let's explore more of the custom modifiers. A main one is the corner radius in iOS. This is something that we use a lot. So I'm going to add modifier corner radius. For the VStack, I'm going to set it to 30. Then for the logo, make sure to have this properly selected. Add a corner radius and set the corner radius to 20. Then we're going to select back the VStack. We're also going to add a shadow. And the shadow is going to have a radius of 20. One final change that we can do before we finish is to move the content to the bottom instead. And here for the VStack, we don't have the alignment for top. And typically you would have to use an H tag. So another technique is to use what we call a spacer. The spacer, just like what we saw with the image, is going to use the maximum space, except that is transparent, meaning that it's not visible. And that's perfect. So we're going to insert from the views, we're going to search for spacer and drag it right above the logo. And when we do that, it's going to push the content to the bottom. So you can see here that you can do a lot of things just by dragging and dropping a bunch of elements and setting the options in the inspector. But the thing is, of course, there are limitations to the visual editor. It's going to be really hard to start animating this from the inspector alone, using a lot of techniques that I personally use, such as max width infinity and so much more. And also, as you get familiar with the Xcode and swiftUI, it's just going to be so much faster and so much more powerful to do everything in code, especially with the amazing auto-completion in Xcode. That's exactly what we're going to start learning in the next section. So I'll see you in the next session. Hello and welcome to the third session of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to learn how to do everything in code. Previously we have learned how to work with the inspectors, and how to drag and drop a bunch of things as we get more familiar with Xcode. And today we're going to take it a step further, and we're going to use techniques that are not possible in the inspectors alone. Starting with the placeholders. If you're using the inspectors and the visual editor, you're going to notice that sometimes it gives you these placeholder values. For most of them, it's fine, except when you want to customize, for example, the text, sometimes it won't work correctly. But also, when you look at the background, you see that it says view, but in reality, we have set up the background color. And typically what you want to do with the placeholder values is you double click on them, and most of them is fine because those are the actual values that you should write in code. But when it comes to the view, you can see that when I double click, it just becomes empty. And therefore we have to replace the same code that says view, but in reality it says the color background with actual code. So what we're going to do is the easiest thing, which is to bring the library. So we're going to go to the colors, and we're going to drag and drop the background color right in between the parentheses, just like that. And it's going to do exactly the same as before, except that now is not a placeholder value. So it's pretty cool to be able to drag and drop your images, your colors, all of these objects, not just in the visual editor in the preview, but also directly to the code. And that also gives you the equivalent, which is going to help you become familiar with how to do everything in code eventually. Next, we're going to take a look at the max width infinity. So looking at the problem here, we see that we want to make sure that this container here is going to have a fixed height of 350, but at the same time, we want the width to be adaptive, to take 100%. And right now, swiftUI ensures that we only take the minimum size possible based on the content, but our content is not expanding enough. So this text here is not consistent. Sometimes it's going to grow bigger, sometimes it's going to grow smaller, depending on what content that you have. A fix for that is to use one modifier, which is the frame, as you are familiar with. So dot frame. And when you do that, it's going to give you the auto completion. And this is really important to get familiar with because it's going to give you all the possibilities, just the same way you would bring the library. You have the auto completion for the code, and it tells you what is feasible in terms of objects and modifiers. And in this case, we have the width, height, alignment. While it is good to see what is feasible with all of these options, sometimes you have too many options, you have too many placeholders, and it becomes more cumbersome to have to edit all of them. You can also start from scratch, which is just using the parentheses. So let's select this one, and we're going to use the max width column dot infinity. So what this does is that it's going to take the maximum available space. And just like in the options, we also have alignment. So again, you can use auto completion, press enter. It's going to autocomplete with the placeholder value. Now for the alignment, again, we're going to use the dot notation. And here we have more options. In this case, we're going to use leading for left so that our text is going to align within the bounding box. So the bounding box is taking the maximum possible size, and it's going to align the content to the left. So this is a really good technique to keep your code clean and to avoid using the spacer or another container, which would be the H tag. Next, unlike in the inspector, we can add as many of the same type modifiers as you want. So for example, if we want to have multiple paddings, that is absolutely feasible. So right after the first padding, let's say I want to add an extra 20 padding vertically, I can do so by doing dot padding. So the same code as before, and we can set to vertical, comma, and we're going to set to 20. So this adds 20 more padding top and bottom. Then we can add another padding modifier to the left and the right side so that our container here doesn't hug too much the borders of the screens. So it is important to understand the order of the modifiers. And when you create these, it's as if each modifier is a container. So it's like saying, okay, we have the first padding that is 20, and then we have the second one, and then we set the frame, and then we set the color, and after that we set the corner radius and the shadow, and finally we want to set some spacing after all of this styling. So let's do that. Padding, and we're going to set horizontal to 20. And you can see that this padding is done after the styling versus this padding is done before the background color. If I move this padding right after the frame and before the background color, you can see that it acts completely differently than if I put this after the shadow. And that's why the order of the modifiers is essential to understand. Now, what about the colors? So here we have these two texts that are secondary, and we want to make sure that they're using the system colors. And if you're familiar with the iOS color guide, we have primary color, which is black, and it changes automatically to white in dark mode. So on this second text here, in the inspector, we have access to some of these colors, but also the preset colors, but we're missing the system colors, which are essential. So to do that, we can type dot and use the modifier called foreground color. And we can use dot again to have access to the same color options, but more than what is available in the inspector. In this case, we're going to use secondary. So this is going to become gray, but it's a little bit more than just gray because it's going to adapt to dark mode. And later on, you're going to learn about vibrancy. So I apply foreground color dot secondary. We're going to also do the same with the third text. So dot foreground color dot secondary. Next, we're going to take a look at the shadow. And right now we're using shadow, which is a radius setting, and that's kind of limited. You can see that I can't customize more than that in the inspector. But what you can do in code, sometimes you can just replace the same code and study the options. So I'm just going to delete dot shadow. So right after dot, type shadow again and see what kind of options that I have. By default, we have just the radius, but we also have another one that says color radius X and Y values. Double click on that and it gives us the placeholders. So based on the same notion, we can use, for example, dot primary for color. For the radius, again, if you're a designer or if you work with design tools, you should be familiar with the radius and XY positions. So we're going to set to radius 10, X0, and Y 10. So this gives us a completely different types of drop shadow. Now on top of the primary, which is black and then white in dark mode, I might want to use a custom color. So let me just delete dot primary, and I'm going to go to the library, go to the colors, and I'm going to drag and drop the shadow like this. Or you can just type the same code and it's going to yield the same result. So I have my drop shadow color. I might want to add some opacity, and one technique that I really like, instead of changing that in my color set and doing that manually, I want to make it super flexible so I can just add a modifier to the color view. So dot opacity, and I'm going to set it to 0.3. So that is 30% opacity, and that gives me my very custom drop shadow. So we're starting to feel that we have more control over the design and we're pushing the limits. Another thing we can do is, for example, we want to transform the text to uppercase, and that's easily done in code. I'm going to go to this text right here, the second text. And since this is a string, which is expressed with quotes and with the text inside the quotes, I can just do dot afterwards and uppercased, again using the auto completion. the task is very easy. Now you can see that coding is not that scary, especially when Xcode gives you errors in real time. So for example, if I make a mistake, you can see that it's not going to run, it's not going to have the proper color. And so you can always do Command Z or redo Command Shift Z. And so you play around with the code, you make mistakes, and you get familiar with this. It's going to become a lot less scary. At the end of the day, you also want to make sure that your code is super readable. You have a VStack image text, and then you have a bunch of modifiers. You can also play around with the indentation, for example. You can do tab, just like any code editor, to fix the indentation. It's just going to start clicking after 10, 20 hours of coding. It's going to become almost like a reflex. So the next thing I want to show you before we get deeper into the code is how to use the preview. There are already a lot of options that are available right here. So for example, if I want to change some of the options, I can click on the fourth button, and here I can change the device. So for example, I can change it to the Pro Max, which has a bigger frame. This is going to take a little bit of time to load, but what is different from changing from this device right here, which should be iPhone 13 by default, and sometimes when you connect back and forth, it's going to default to another device. You can always go back to your selected device that you prefer. But otherwise, this is different. This is the preview, and the preview will override what you have here. And you can change based on the options that you have here. Or you can decide to not change anything. But right now, I have the iPhone 13 Pro Max, and I can change to any of the other devices as well, such as the iPhone 13 mini, and it's going to change my preview. Another thing that we can do is to change the layout. So for example, if you don't want to have the preview of a device, you can also set to size that fits, and this is going to take the size of the content itself. Then we also have a fixed size. Here I can set 600 to 600, but sometimes it's a little bit hard to edit in the inspector here. So I can change it directly in code, especially when you have placeholder values like that. Double click on it, and it's going to fix whatever issue that you may have with editing in the inspector. So this is what I have, and this is simply a modifier to the preview. And notice that this code section here is completely separated from the main, and that's because this is only for the preview. So if I remove this code, it's going to entirely remove my preview, and that is the key difference. You can always play with the code. So for example, if I don't want to have the preview layout, I can just delete the modifier, and now I'm back to just my preview device. And make sure to resume to update your preview. Next, I know that's surprising, but this year we have a new feature for rotating your device for the preview, and you can see how your layout is going to look like in landscape mode, how it's going to adapt. Later on, you're going to learn about the save area, but you can see that the card itself is taking the maximum size possible based on the size of the screen, and we have the 350 in terms of height. So you can rotate again, and voila, now we're back. We can always delete this. Next, we're going to take a look at the color scheme. So we can switch to dark mode. This is really useful for testing for those color schemes. And we can also change the dynamic type, for example, to see how it's going to look like when the user sets to extra large. And this is how it looks like. We can fix the layout later. And finally, we can also duplicate the preview. And again, this is super useful so that you don't have to switch back and forth. You can just decide that the first content view is going to have the default settings, and the second one is going to have dark mode. So now we have two previews next to each other. We can play with those settings yet again, and we're going to be able to test super quickly against all of these options. So I hope you found these techniques useful. We're going to go even deeper in the next session and look at the material features in swiftUI 3. So I'll see you in the next session. Welcome back to a fourth session of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to cover material specifically for swiftUI and also how to use it in the context of a foreground style or a background modifier. So what is material? Well, it is this layer that is blurring the background. It's kind of giving this frosted glass effect. And it's really important for making sure that your text is super readable in front of a busy background or something that might be in the way of the text. It's really good for overlays such as the tab bar here, or sometimes when you have a background, you can use a card. And most commonly, you're going to use that for something that is very much above everything else, such as the modal or the control center in iOS, as well as the lock screen. To apply that in Xcode 13, it's super easy. Anything that is a background or a foreground style, or even more that we're going to explore in the future, can accept the material sheet. So instead of the color that we have applied for the background, we're going to do dot regular material. This is going to set the background to the material sheet layer. Now you don't see anything at the moment, and that's because we don't have a background. So what we're going to do is to add a second background. So here we have the first background, and this is applying before the corner radius, the shadow, and the padding. But if you want to add a second background after all of that, you can do dot background. And in this case, instead of using a color or a material, we're going to use an image. So type image, parentheses, and we're going to use double quotes. And inside that, we're going to use the name of the image. So if you don't remember the name of the image, you can always drag and drop the image itself, or we can just search for the image that we want. So in this case, we're going to use blob1. So type exactly the same name, and there you go, we have the image. So you can see that we have the material sheet on top of the background and it's blurring it. Now the material has different degree of thickness, and this is the default one, so regular, but you can also use ultra thin, which is the thinnest, and you're going to see more of the background, more of the colors and the vibrancy. And if you want to see less of that, you can use the ultra thick material. And now we're barely seeing the colors of the background. Now let me just put it back to ultra thin. And I'm going to move the background a little bit. So this is my view, which is the image inside the parentheses. And on that view, I can add a modifier called dot offset. Like this, and I'm gonna move the X position to 250 and the Y position to -100. So there you go. This is essentially applying a CSS transform. So it's applying the translate and transform without affecting the rest of the elements and based on the original position of this element. Now, it is important to understand that even though we're inside parentheses of the background modifier, we can have more elements and more nested modifiers like this. And that makes swiftUI super powerful and super composable in terms of how you want to set your layout in the least amount of code possible without having to use so many containers like in other platforms. While we're on this topic of background and foreground, and overlays, another thing that we can do is to apply this image on top of the card, but without being restricted by the bounding box of this card. So one modifier that we can use is called the overlay, and you can decide where you want to use that. So right after the background, we're going to set .overlay, and inside the parentheses, we're going to use it the same way as the background, and we're going to add an image. So image, parentheses, and the name of the image. So let's take a look at what we can use. We're going to use, let's say, the illustration 5. So illustration 5. And we're going to need to resize that. So dot resizable. This is going to make sure to take all the available space. And we're also going to need to respect the aspect ratio. So dot aspect ratio, we're going to use one of these options. We don't need the first option, so we can just delete the value plus the comma. And we only need the content mode. For the content mode, it's going to be dot fit. The image is still too big, so we're going to set the frame so that the height is fixed to 230. So now it's roughly the size that we want, and we're going to use the offset to move it using x32, y minus 80. So roughly like the design. Now, what is the difference between overlay and background? Well, essentially, background is going to be underneath and overlay is going to be above. So if I set this to background, you're going to see that it's going to be underneath everything and it's going to be behind the material sheet. So let me put it back to overlay, and there we go. Next, let's talk about the foreground style. So far, we have used foreground color and we're using secondary. What you're going to notice is that in swiftUI 3, this is going to automatically use vibrancy when you use secondary. But for foreground color, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So for example, you can barely see it, but the third text has vibrancy, but the second text doesn't. So let me just move back to 0 and it's going to be a little bit more obvious. You can see here it's slightly blue, but this one remains gray. So to make sure that you're actually using vibrancy, you can switch to foreground style for the second text. So foreground style, secondary. And now you can see there's a little bit of blue in the text. So the difference between foreground color and foreground style is that you can do more things with it. For example, you can apply a gradient, you can use a material sheet if you want, and you can even have multiple colors. So this is a lot more powerful, and we're going to explore that later. For now, we're going to try to apply a gradient, let's say on the title. So previously, it was fairly complex to apply a gradient on the text. You had to use some sort of a masking, you had to create a shape, and then you had to use the text as a mask. But now it's super easy. So we're going to just do foreground style on the title and then dot linear gradient. So make sure that you're using the one that says colors, start point and end point. That's the simplest one. So double click that. Now the first value is that we have an array of colors expressed by the brackets and then the start point. So you can change the direction of your gradient. So let's start with the array. Here we're going to do dot red, comma, dot blue. And it's not going to apply yet. It's going to give us an error unless we finish applying the rest of the values, such as the start point is going to be top leading, so top left, and then bottom trailing. And there you go. So you have the red from the top left to the blue in the bottom right. Let me just change that to primary. And if you remember, primary is black in light mode, white in dark mode. And so we want this text to adapt, which is why we're using primary. And then we're also going to use primary for the second color, except we're going to use opacity to 0.5. And this is what we have so far. It's barely visible, but I wanted to show you how to apply a gradient on the text. And you can definitely play with the colors that suit best with your design. Let's take a look at the dark mode preview. We're going to deal with the accessibility later, so let me just disable that for now. Just click on X here, and there you go. So we have the gradient on the title, and we have the vibrancy on the two texts that is using secondary as a foreground style. The floating image here is using overlay, And this is going to allow us to animate it and do some interesting parallax effect. Before we finish, let me just put back the offset of the blob 1. So I'm going to set it to X250. And that's the new material in iOS 15. You have ultra thin, ultra thick, regular, but also you have two more options. So we have thin and thick as well. And the new background, overlay, and foreground style can accept material and so much more, such as secondary for vibrancy, but also we can write the linear gradient in a different way. And this is so much shorter than before, where we had to use the view. So a lot of improvements in swiftUI 3, and we're going to explore even more in the next session. I'll see you then. Welcome back to the 5th session of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to learn about shapes, we're going to learn about stroke, how to apply blending mode, as well as masking and clip shape. I think you're going to find a lot of interesting techniques and appreciate the nuances between each of the modifiers and views that we're going to be using. First of all, let's talk about masking, because right now we're using this card right here and it's using a corner radius. What you don't realize is that the corner radius actually masks the content. So for example, if I was to move the third text using an offset, and you don't have to follow me on this one, so I'm going to move, let's say 100 or even 50, you can see that the content is being masked by the corner radius. If I disable the corner radius by doing command /, this disables the code, and you can see that the text reappears outside of the card when I disable the corner radius. Now, I'm going to show you a different way of masking, because we will be using corner radius, except that we're going to have a lot more options by using shapes. So right after corner radius, we're going to set clip shape. And for this shape, let's say we're going to start with the circle parentheses. And you can see when I do this, I have the circle that is masking the entire thing. And right after the circle, we're applying the drop shadow as well as the padding and the other backgrounds. Now there's another way of using masking instead of using clip shape, and it's called simply mask. It does exactly the same thing, except with a key difference, which is you can apply the opacity. So for example, if I was to apply opacity of 0.5 on the circle, you can see that the opacity works. And even with a gradient with opacity, it would work the same way. Now, if I was to switch that to clip shape, the opacity doesn't work anymore. In fact, the code stops working until I remove the opacity modifier, and now it works again. So that is the key difference, and I'm going to use mask because typically it's a little bit more versatile. Now there are a number of shapes that you can create in swiftUI, starting with the circle. Also, something similar to the circle is the ellipse, which simply means that it's not going to necessarily respect the aspect ratio. For example, if you set the frame to width 300 and height 200, you can see that it doesn't have to be a perfect circle. Versus if I was to switch that back to circle, it's always going to have a perfect aspect ratio. And then there's the rectangle, which is pretty straightforward. And next, we're also going to look at the capsule. The capsule is like a pill-shaped button, and it's going to round the corners on each end where the width or the height is shortest. So for example, I can switch the number to 300 and then 100. You can see that the rounded corners are at the bottom and top instead of left and right. Now let's go back to the corner radius that we have set earlier. And the equivalent of that in shape is called the rounded rectangle. And for the rounded rectangle, you're going to need to set the value for the corner radius. And the corner radius is the same as the corner radius modifier. So we can set that to 30. And we can remove the frame because we don't need to restrict the size. So there you go. It does exactly the same as before, except that now we can also use a style for the rounded rectangle. So we can add a new value called style and dot. So we have continuous and circular. Circular is what we have by default, but continuous is what you find in iOS. This is what we call the smooth corners, the super ellipse. We have many variations of that name. But if you look at iOS, you can see that the app icons use the smooth corners. Most of these UIs and buttons use the smooth corners. It gives that very unique language that you find in iOS. So if you want to give your UI that iOS feel, this is worth the extra effort instead of using just the corner radius. In fact, if you go to Figma to set the smooth corners, you're going to have to go to the corner radius. In more options, you're going to find that you can control the default, which is the normal corner radius. But if you go more to 60%, this is what you find in iOS. And then even more, it's going to look more squishy, blobby, whatever you call it, but it makes your design a little bit more fun. But in iOS, it's simply called continuous, and we're setting the corner radius to 30. Now let's apply the same for the logo here. So we're going to go to the logo 2. Let's add a padding of 9 on all sides. And we're also going to add a background. Now on top of this, we can decide to not apply a mask. And this is new in iOS 15. With the background modifier, you can add, after let's say the color or the material, we can add a comma and set in column, and we're going to set the shape itself. So rounded rectangle, parentheses, and just the same way, we're going to have corner radius of 30 and style continuous. So this does exactly the same as this, except that it's combined with the material. In fact, I don't need the mask modifier anymore. And when I do that, only keeping the background modifier with the in value, I don't have the masking anymore, as you can see with the second text that is outside of the card. So this is really useful for that. Now I'm going to apply almost the same style on the logo. So let me go to logo 2. I'm going to set padding of 9. And then I'm going to set a background with ultra thin material in rounded rectangle, parentheses, corner radius. This time is going to be 20, style continuous. Next, let's talk about the stroke. Now this is something a little bit more experimental and not something that you see often in iOS, except for some buttons, but you're going to see more often in macOS, where you're going to have a border, a drop shadow, and sometimes even a gradient on that border. So I'm going to show you how to do that in swiftUI. So let's go back to the card itself. And right after overlay, we're going to add another overlay, and we're going to use the rounded rectangle, the same corner radius, let's say 30, and continuous. Now what you're going to see is that because of the order that I'm using, which is after the padding, it's going to be bigger than the actual size. So I might want to move this modifier right before that padding. And there we go. Let me just set the indentation properly so that it's more readable and easier to apply new modifiers. And if I want to set a stroke, I have this little modifier called .stroke. And so I have my 1-point stroke. If you want to customize that, we can go inside the parentheses and put, let's say, the color. I'm going to set to black and comma. And we're going to set the line width to, let's say, 2. Or instead of line width, there's something called style. And the style gives you even more option. And we can do .init. So here we have a lot of options. So I'm going to select all of them. And we're going to start with the line width. Let's say we're going to set to 5. The line cap can have a style for dashed lines. So for example, I can set it to .round, just like the Apple Watch rings, and line join round as well. Meter limit, we can set it to infinity, and for the dash, we can set to an array of values. In this case, we can set to 100, 20, and the dash phase, we can set it to 10. So I can play with these values, and you can see that I can set 50, 10, and then maybe 20. It's gonna move around and then play around with the dash spacing and the width of the lines. For those interested, we have similar values in the design tool, in stroke, advanced stroke, and here I can set to dash, and now I have the dash value and the gap value. So 100, 50, and then we have the cap, so I can set to rounded, as well as the join, and it's going to give me roughly the same values as in swiftUI. I'm not an expert in this, so definitely play with your own values and see how they match. For now, let me just put it back to solid. Back in Xcode, while we started playing with the stroke style, we don't actually need that for the design. So we're going to delete everything in between the parentheses. And now we're just going to apply a linear gradient. And here I like to use the colors one, so it's simpler for me. And for the array of colors, I'm going to start with dot white, comma, dot black. For the start point, I'm going to set to top, then endpoint bottom. And there we go. We have our gradient right here. I'm also going to set opacity on the white color to 0.3 and the black color dot opacity to 0.1. So it's a little bit more like the design. And on top of that, we're going to apply the blending mode on the view itself, which is the rounded rectangle. And we're going to use that as a modifier for that view. So it's going to be blend mode. And here inside the parentheses, dot. And now we have access to a bunch of the blending modes that you have in most design tools. So the common ones such as overlay, color burn, color dodge, darken, etc. Here we're going to use overlay. And when you apply that, and when that is done, you'll see that the outline blends a little bit better with the background. You can see here we have the light and then the dark border. And likewise for the dark mode, you can see the outline here, and you'll want to play with the opacity to make it more or less obvious. Let me put back the third text the way it was by removing the offset. It's worth mentioning that when you translate some of these effects, such as the blending mode as well as the material sheet, it's not going to be 100% accurate. And you're going to need to adjust a little bit in swiftUI or in the design tool and see what looks best, which is why you should work with your designers, because, for example, text vibrancy works very different in swiftUI versus the way you would do in Figma. For example, there's no option for text vibrancy in Figma, and you would have to use something like blending mode. So you can see here, I had to use a bunch of fills that is using the overlay blending mode to create something roughly similar to what you find in swiftUI. So I hope you found these nuances interesting, and I hope it's going to motivate you to play with some of these values to get the best results possible. In the next session, I want to show you how to create your custom modifiers or collections of modifiers as a style so that we can reuse it many places in your app. So I'll see you in the next session. Welcome to the 6th session of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to learn about reusable view modifiers. So you're going to be able to create your own custom styles, which means that you can combine a bunch of modifiers that you find repetitive. You want to use it multiple places, and you want to create a style out of that. So for example, if you look at the background modifier, it's pretty unique because we have the ultra thin material, plus we have the custom rounded corners, and that is a little bit of code to create the effect that we want. especially when we look at some of these other styles that we have, such as the border that is on the overlay, and this is a custom rounded corners, as well as a stroke with gradient and a blending mode. So some of these should definitely be part of the style so that we can reuse it in multiple places. First of all, before we begin, we're going to need to create a new file. We're going to open the left navigator, so you can click on this button right here, or Command 0 to open it. So let me just open here, and we don't need the inspector anymore. So to save space, we're going to disable the inspectors. Now, from here, you can do Command N, or you can right click and new file. So if you right click, it's going to create a file right after where you right click. Otherwise, if you do Command N, it's also going to create a new file from the file that is currently selected. Now in this screen, we have iOS, and we're going to create a swiftUI view. We're going to click on Next. We're going to name the file Styles and then Create. So the target is going to be design code iOS15 and then Create. So there you go. This is how you create a new file. Typically you do that if you want to have a new screen, a new component, or you can also create a bunch of models or styles, and that's exactly what we're doing here. For this file, we're not going to use the preview, which means that we don't need this code portion. So when you do that and remove it, it's going to also remove the preview portion. Now this part is where you're creating your UI. And again, since we're only creating styles, we don't really need the UI itself. We are going to need something else. So we have the import swiftUI left, and that is important to keep it. Next, we're going to type struct. We're going to name it stroke style. And typically the naming convention in Swift is to have the name of the element, and at the end is going to be the type of the element. So content view is for any element in Swift, and typically it's made for UI or screens. So content is the name. For example, if I had a detail screen or an article screen, I would name those article view. For the styles, again, this is where we're going to put all the styles, and each of the name plus the type, which is a style. After that, colon, and it's going to be of type view modifier. Now we could also have named this modifier, so stroke modifier, but I like to keep style because you can also have button styles, which is very similar to the way you compose view modifier. Let's keep it like this, and after that we're gonna do curly braces, enter. Typically when you type curly braces and you press enter afterwards, it's going to create the N1. And it's really important in coding that whenever you open something, you have to close it, whether it's parentheses or curly braces. It's really important to open and close. And then here, usually Swift is really good at detecting autocompletion. In this context, we have a view modifiers. So now we're gonna type func body, and here it gives us a very good autocompletion. So we can just double click on it and it autocompletes for us. So the body, and we're gonna get the content. So if you have done a bit of coding, this is what you receive from the function. And we're gonna be able to use this to apply the custom modifiers that we want. And here we need to return a view. So a view is anything that is UI typically. So now we're going to use the content. So the content being pretty much any view. So if you remember, like we have the different images, text, and then we're going to be able to apply our custom modifiers to that content. So let's go back to the content view, and we're going to scroll down, and we're going to start with this overlay modifier. So let me select it. It's really important to select the whole thing. And another trick that you can do is double click on the parentheses to know exactly where it ends. Again, really important to know where it opens and where it closes. And we're also going to select the modifier itself. So dot overlay, parentheses, everything inside, plus end of parentheses. And now we're going to do Command X to cut. We're going to bring that to styles, and we're going to paste that to Command V on the content. So there you go. This is our style. And if we want to apply this style to our content view, we're going to do dot modifier, parentheses, and then stroke style, parentheses. And this is going to do exactly the same thing as what we had before, referencing to the stroke style that we just created. So let me resume the preview. And there we go. We have the exact same style as before. In this case, the border that we have set earlier. Next, I want to show you that we can even simplify this by creating a view extension. We can go back to styles, and then at the end of the curly braces, I'm going to type extension to the view being pretty much all of the UI elements in Swift. And we are going to create a function stroke style. And this time, it's really important to differentiate between lowercase and cap. Typically, when you use caps is when you're referencing to something that is already existing. For example, a view from the swiftUI framework or something that you have created custom, like a model or a view modifier. And when you create something that is lowercase, typically it's something that you use locally or something that is custom, like a newly declared variable. So in this case, we're using lowercase because it's a convention for the modifiers. And then we're going to set parentheses, return some view. And then we're going to reference the modifier the same way that we did earlier. So modifier, parentheses, stroke style, parentheses. Again, super important to have the correct caps or lowercase. Now with this set, we're going to be able to go back to content view, and instead of writing it this way, we can write the equivalent. So it's optional, but that's why we did the extension view. So we can write it stroke style, just like a modifier, and then boom, we have our custom modifier, just like you have the shadow, the padding, the background, and it does exactly the same as before. It's pretty cool. Because of this, we're going to be able to reuse this custom modifier. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to bring that to the image logo 2, and I'm going to put that right after the background. Now notice that the corner radius is different. This is supposed to be 20, but the one that we have set is 30. So we want to be able to customize our modifier just the same way that you can set the font to bold, or you can set the foreground style or the line limit. You want to pass some value to customize the modifiers. So one thing you can do in Xcode is to command click on whatever modifier, and you're going to get to the source of it. And typically it's really good for documentations. And so for example, if I want to command click here, jump to definition for the background, it's going to give me some documentation about it and what are some of the available options that I can use. Sometimes we have comments and all that stuff. Of course, this is coming from the swiftUI framework, so it's very, very large. But going back, clicking on the back and forward, you can go back and forward just like a browser, which is really cool. And I can command click on my custom modifier. It's going to go exactly to my styles directly without having to navigate manually. Sometimes you're going to have 20, 30, 50 files, and it's going to become really hard to navigate manually. So it's typically better to just command click on the element and go directly to the file. So in this case, it's going directly to the extension view, which is referencing the stroke style. Command click on it. It's going to go to here. And now I'm noticing that corner radius to 30 is hard-coded, and I want to be able to customize that. So to customize it, I'm going to set var corner radius is equal to 30.0. Now, when you have numbers, we have multiple types of numbers like a double or a CG float. And the thing is, when you code in Swift, it's type safe. So in order to be able to use some of these functions and methods, you're going to have to respect whatever expected type that it is. It's just like TypeScript using JavaScript. So this is to ensure that all the autocompletion is going to work, and we have all of these errors that we see in real time. So all of that is going to check if your type is correct. And if you want to see if the type is correct, one essential trick to find the values and their types is to option click on the modifiers and the views. And here it's going to give you the documentation about it, but also it's going to give you all the possible values and their type. So whenever you see this column here, that means that, you know, this line width is of type CG float, for example, and CG float is expressed with the dot and the decimal value. Another thing you can do is, let's say I don't want to type the decimal value, but then it doesn't know if it's a double or a CG float, and it's going to probably think that it's a double, but it's going to complain that this is supposed to be a CG float. So you have to specify the type by doing colon CG float. And there we go. This is a CG float. So if I option click here, it says CG float. But if I remove that type, it's going to say that it's actually an integer. So I was wrong about double, but it's actually an integer. Now I'm explaining a lot of this stuff, but don't worry too much. Xcode is going to give you these errors. And the most important thing is that you understand that some of these errors is because of the type. And when Xcode gives you these errors, you're going to be able to fix them with the suggestions of Xcode, and it's going to transform those different types to the correct type that some of these views and modifiers are expecting. If the value type is incorrect, and I put this corner radius that I just declared, I replace the actual value that was hard-coded to corner radius, Xcode is going to complain. And here it's just going to say, cannot convert to integer. Do you want to replace this with a CG float? And it's going to try to transform it. It's going to make your code uglier, which means that you might as well just specify the type right here by doing this or doing this. So of type CG float or the value. And if you set it like this, then it's going to understand that this is supposed to be a CG float. Another technique in Xcode is if you're making changes and you're not sure if it's going to work or not, you should be building your code. So Command B to ensure that whatever errors is going to disappear, or if your code is fine. Another important thing to understand is that if you don't set the default value, then the value becomes essential and you have to set it everywhere whenever you call the stroke style or the modifier. So for example, if I remove the default value, it needs to know, well, what is this value supposed to be? And it's going to complain that it is missing the argument. But if you do set the default value, it's not going to complain because it's going to automatically revert to that default value that you have set. So we're going to remove that. And here we're going to make that essential. Then we're going to go to the stroke style inside the parentheses, and we're going to type corner radius because this stroke style requires that value. And we can set it to 30.0. But we also want to be able to customize this value from this modifier. So in order to customize that, we're going to pass that from the function. So receiving the value corner radius of type CG float is equal to 30. And by passing that to the function, I'm going to be passing that value corner radius to the view modifier that we have set earlier. So corner radius. Notice that here we're setting a default value, but here we're not setting a default value, which means that when we're going to set this stroke style modifier, we don't have to set a value if we don't want to. But if we call it from the modifier stroke style, we're going to need to pass that value. So let's put that in practice. We're going to go back to content view, and you can see here Xcode is not complaining. But if I was to use modifier stroke style and just empty parentheses, it's going to complain because I'm missing an argument. So going back to stroke style, which is the view extension, it's not going to complain anymore. And sometimes you're going to need to resume or do Command B for doing the code checking again to see that if your code is correct. So if you see this is green, that means that everything is good. If you see that this is red, it means that this is not able to build. Now you see that we're setting to the default value, so we still have it wrong, but that value is optional with a default value. So now I can set to a custom value, and I want to set this to 20 instead. And when I do that, boom, it's beautiful, and it's following the same corner radius as what I have in the background. And going down, you can see that this one is simply going to the default value because corner radius is optional. Now, before we go, I want to show you a really awesome technique for adapting to dark mode. And we can adapt our modifier to light mode and dark mode. In this example, I want to make sure that my border is a little bit more visible in dark mode so that the opacity is going to be less. So one thing that is really cool about swiftUI is that you can use the environment settings of your app. So for example, I'm going to type commercial A, so at environment, parentheses, backward slash, dot. And this is where I can get any of the app settings to use as condition and apply that to adapt my UI. So for example, I'm going to use color scheme, and I'm going to name that var color scheme. So you can use the same name that is in the framework. This simply means that I can get whatever the user has set, whether it's dark mode or light mode, and apply that as a condition. So write it where it says opacity 0.3, right before 0.3, I'm going to set color scheme. Let's just make sure that we have a space between color scheme and the value, and then double equal sign dot light or dark, because this is color scheme, so I know that it's either light or dark. In this case, I'm going to ask if it's dark, question mark. So this is kind of a condition. It's asking, okay, is the color scheme dark, question mark? If yes, I'm going to set it to 0.6 in terms of opacity, and in colon, which means otherwise, then I'm going to set it to 0.3. So again, is the color scheme equal to dark, question mark? If yes, set to 0.6, otherwise set it to 0.3. Now, thanks to this, I'm going to be able to go back to my UI and resume. And you're going to see that the opacity for this line here is going to be a lot more obvious now for dark mode. So I'm going to do the same for the black opacity. And I'm going to set color scheme. Make sure to have some space. Double equal sign dot dark question mark 0.3, otherwise 0.1. You might have to resume this twice sometimes, but eventually, if you don't see the resume anymore, then it works. You can see here that my border is a lot more visible now in dark mode, especially on this logo here. Now we seem to have a little bit of an issue with the rounded corners using the style continuous. So to fix this, what we can do is to set the corner radius to 16. And likewise, we're going to have to apply the background corner radius as well to 16. And this should fix our issue. At the same time, the corner radius of the logo itself, we can set it to 10. It fits better with the corner radius of the borders, which are larger. Another thing that I want to show you is in styles, sometimes you're going to have a lot of code like this. And one way to make sense of it is to set the indentation properly. So for example, at the beginning, right after the opening parentheses or curly braces, you can put the code in another line. The same for the stroke here. The linear gradient can be in another line, as well as the colors. As a result, it's important to set the ending of the parentheses in its own line as well, so that it's easier to find ourselves. And then the end of the linear gradient, going to be on its own line, so you know that the stroke starts here and ends here. The linear gradient starts here and ends here. Now the next level would be the square brackets, which is pretty long, so we can put that in its own line as well. So the first value of the square brackets, and then the second value, which is black, and then the end of the square brackets, and voila. So sometimes Xcode is not going to give you the lines properly. What you can do is to select all of the code that you want to indent properly and do Control I. And when you do that, it's going to indent every single piece of code that you have selected properly. So for example, if I was to have this like this and it's kind of confusing, I can always select the entire thing, Control I, and voila, it sets the indentation properly for everything. It's really, really useful, keeps your code clean, and when you do these super long conditions, then it's going to be a lot easier to read. So I ended up explaining a lot more in this session than I was planning to. So this is really worth watching again. If you don't understand any portion, take your time. It's okay. You don't have to understand everything, but I think that a lot of these techniques and a lot of these explanations are really going to help you do the best code possible. Most importantly, play with your values, play with your designs, and see what works and what doesn't work, and try to break the app in the least amount of steps possible. Go back and forth. It's going to make you a better coder. It's going to help you get familiar with swiftUI and have a lot of fun along the way. So in the next session, we're going to learn about list style and how to set a very basic navigation view. It's going to be really useful, and I'll see you in the next session. Welcome to the 7th session of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to look at the new list styles in iOS 15, and we're going to learn how to create a simple screen using the navigation view. First of all, we're going to create a new file. So Command N, again, swiftUI view. Since this is a screen, we're going to name it account view. Create. Let's make sure to resume the preview. And here we're going to command click on the text element, and we have a lot more options. So we're going to select embed in list. Just with this, you have the list. But not just that, we're looping through a number of items. And in this case, it's simply looping 5 times. So we have 5 items in the UI. Now you might want to double click this so that the values are no longer placeholders. Now I can change the content. So for example, I can set to settings, and it's going to change all of the items at once. If I want to change the style, I'm going to go right after the list, after the curly braces. I'm going to set the modifier called list style. And here I can set dot. Then I have a bunch of options. So these are all the styles that I can use. For example, I'm going to set the sidebar style. The sidebar is typically for macOS and iPad, but also on iOS, you would have a navigation that goes across multiple views, going inside each item and then going back and forth. just like in the Shortcuts app. But the style itself mostly fits for the iPad sidebar. One thing to keep in mind is that if you don't specify the list style, it's going to take the default style and it's going to be different across platforms. But it's very common to use plain if you want to customize more. Then if you want to group your items, so let's say you have this group here with a title, another group with another title, then you would use group or inset group, then automatic, and that's going to be changing based on the platform. You can also option click on the values and it's going to explain a little bit more, or option click on the parent modifier and open to developer documentation, click on list style, and sometimes you're going to have these lists in front of you that describes everything. You can search, and it's really useful for the full list of possibilities. For example, we have carousel here, but the thing is the carousel is only for watchOS. So oftentimes when these options are not showing up in your auto-completion, it's because it's not available for your platform. And it's important to look at the availability and to read a little bit more about what it does. Let me set this to inset group. New in iOS 15, you can customize the style of the list row separators. So I'm going to have to apply this on the inner elements such as the text. So dot list row separator. And here we have two options. One is to change the visibility, or I can change the separator tint by using the color. So we're going to select this one with a tint, and for the color, just like before, I can change to dot red, primary blue. So let's try blue, and you can see that I'm customizing the color of the separator. Additionally, I can also do list row separator and the one with visibility, and here I can set to dot hidden or dot visible if you want to show it, which is by default. But otherwise, if I make it hidden, you can see that I no longer have the lines visible. Next, I want to show you that you can start interacting with your preview, and you can do that by clicking play. And this would be the same as in the simulator. It's just that you won't be able to see the frames and the sizes anymore, and you won't be able to drag and drop elements into the preview the same way as before, unless you go into the non-play mode by stopping it. But let me play back again, and now you can see that I can scroll thanks to the list. Next, I want to show you one of the most popular screen UIs in iOS, which is the navigation view. So we're going to command click on the list, and we're going to click on embed. Instead of container, I'm going to name this navigation view. And when I do that, I can see that I have a navigation bar when I scroll up. I just need to customize the title. To do that, right after list style, again, it has to be on the inner element of the navigation view. After list style, I'm going to type .navigation title using quotes. Let's name that account. So we have the title here, and we have this nice transition that goes into the navigation bar. Now, thanks to the navigation view, I'm going to be able to use all of the options that comes with it. We're going to explore a lot more later, but for example, if we have links here, we're going to be able to navigate back and forth to subscreens, or we can add buttons in the navigation bar in the top right or top left based on the platform. Now back to the list, you can see here that I'm looping using 5 items and they're all the same, but I can also remove that loop by removing the parentheses as well as the item in, which is for data. For now, we just want to manually set all of the list items. For example, right after text settings, I can add another text, and for billing, then another one for help. Notice that the first item does not have the separator, and that's because we have the modifiers here on the first item. What we can do though is to group all of them together and put that as part of that group. And in this case, we can use what we call a section. So let's command click on the first text and embed. We're going to replace container by section. And this is going to allow us to have multiple groups. I can move the modifiers on the first text to the section itself. Let me just fix the indentation and then move the two other texts right inside section next to settings. Like this, the separator modifiers are applying to the entire section instead of a single item. And later on, we're going to be able to have multiple sections. In the next session, we're going to learn about the new SF symbols 3, and it's going to pair really nicely with the text element and the list. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, and welcome back to my 8th session of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to cover SF symbol 3, which is the biggest upgrade since its inception. And we now have 3,100 symbols that we can use for all of Apple's platforms, including iOS, iPadOS, etc. And this is going to work with the San Francisco fonts. If you haven't installed it, make sure to do that. Also, you should go to SF symbol 3 on the page to download the app. Now, what is new in SF symbol 3 is that now we have the ability to change the variants in code, but also we have the new color customizations that we call rendering modes, and there's a better support for custom symbols. Once you have the app installed, it's going to allow you to search and browse all of the symbols that are available. And on top of that, when you select one, you can get to the inspector and you can see where it's available, on which platform, and what version of iOS. So what is new especially is the other inspector, where you can customize the rendering. And now on top of the ones that were previously available, that was monochrome, which is a single color, multicolor, which gives you some of the original colors plus the main one that you select. And that's only possible to some of the icons. But otherwise, we have two more. So one is hierarchical and the other one is palette. Hierarchy allows you to set a single color and is going to change the opacity based on their composition for the icon. So for example, this icon here, you're going to have a single color that is selected, but automatically the icon itself has multiple layers. And so the second one has a certain degree of opacity and the third one even less opacity. This makes for a really cool styling, especially when you have depth in your design, blending well with a background or a color. So the other one that we have is palette. And this is where it gets even more customizable, because now you have 3 colors that you can customize, including the first one, the second one, and then the third one. Of course, not every single icon is going to support all 3 colors. Some of them supports only 1, 2, or 3. But for those that support 3, you have the option to change that. Now, if you want to use these icons in the design tool, all you need to do is to copy the icon itself and then go to the design tool, and you can create a text layer and then paste the actual icon. Now, it's important to use SF Pro in order to make sure that your icon is going to work. And then you can just change the size by using the font size. It's going to be the same for swiftUI as well. But unfortunately, it won't work with the color customizations unless you flatten it, for which case it's no longer a font icon and you're going to have to edit that as a vector and separate the layers and so on. But in swiftUI, you will be able to change those colors using foreground style. So back in Xcode, right before section, we're going to need to use the image. So image, parentheses, and we're going to use the option with the system name. Now the string is using double quotes, and this is where we're going to use the symbol name itself. So let me scroll back up. I'm going to use person, and here I can right click on it, copy the name, and put that right here. So this is great, and for all of these variants, you can just copy the name, and it's gonna change the variant. But what is new with swiftUI 3 is that for some of the basic variants, such as the circle and the fill or the outline mode, you can just use a modifier, and that is going to make your code a lot more flexible. So to do that, I'm going to add a modifier called symbol variant. And here I can set dot circle. And when I do that, it's going to give me the circle variant. It's the equivalent of person dot circle. And if I don't want to have the outline and I want to use a fill, I can just use dot fill. So this is super customizable and easy to work with instead of copying and pasting these super long names. One thing to note is that if it's not specified for these variants, the person symbol is going to look different from iOS to iPadOS or macOS. For example, the person symbol on the tab bar in iOS is going to be filled by default, and for the Mac is going to be outline unless Apple decides to change it later. But yes, it's platform specific if you don't specify these variants. Now, if you want to change the symbol size, just like in the design tool, you can use .font, and then you can use the dynamic type. But also, if you want to use a custom size that is fixed, you can do .system, and I'm going to select the option for size. Let me put that to 32. So you can see now we have a bigger size. Next, we're going to customize the rendering mode. To do that, we're going to use the modifier .symbol rendering mode, and here we have all of these 4 options, including monochrome, multicolor, hierarchy, and palette. And we can use palettes, so I can show you how to customize multiple colors. To do that, we're going to need a symbol that has multiple colors, so person won't work. And this one is very specific, so I won't be using the symbol variants. And we're going to use the one with the check mark, copy the name, and paste that right between the quotes. Once that is done, now I can add a new modifier for foreground style. And remember that foreground color allows you to customize one single color, but foreground style allows you to use material, gradient, and also multiple colors. In this case, we have 2 possible colors. So let's start with the first one, .blue, and then .red. And so you can see that we have 2 colors. I can even replicate the hierarchy rendering mode by using .blue twice, but for the second one, I can use opacity to 0.3. So this gives you the ability to customize the opacity values of each of those layers that are customizable in colors. Now I can customize this even further by adding a background with materials. So let me add some padding, and then I'm going to add .background, and the background is going to be a circle, .fill, so that I can customize the color of the shape itself, and the fill can use a material, so ultra thin material. So if I want to make the material a little bit more interesting, I can add another background, but this time I'm going to use an SF symbol. So image, parentheses, system name, and let's use hexagon. Right now you don't really see it because it's small and also it's centered. Let me just add some styling to my SF symbol, and I'm going to use the font. I'm going to set the system size to 200, and now we're going to start seeing it. I might want to add fill, so I'm going to set symbol variant to .fill, and finally add a color to it, so .foreground color to .blue. Let me move it a little bit by using .offset, and the X value is going to be -50, the Y value -100. So now we're starting to see some interesting shapes. What is interesting here is that we're using SF symbol as a shape to make our UI a little bit more interesting instead of designing it in Figma and then exporting the image. So SF Symbols 3 has these really simple shapes that you can use for your design, for your background, for a confetti or something like that, without having to generate those images. Now let's structure our layout here a little bit. For the image, we're going to embed this first into a VStack. And the VStack, we're going to need to set a frame to max width .infinity. So this is going to allow us to take the full width, otherwise it takes the minimum width. And now this is more centered. Next, I want to show you the label. So when you have text and you want to use it next to an SF symbol, you can use the H tag and put the text and image together, but there's also an easier way by simply using label. So you change from text to label, and then you set comma after the quotes, and we're going to set the system name to, let's say, gear for settings. So you can see that we have the gear right next to text. We're going to do the same for billing, so change it to label, set to system name, credit card, and finally help, label, comma, system name, question mark. One important thing to note is that your SF symbol is always going to perfectly align with your text, but you can also customize the symbol size versus the text by using a modifier called image scale, and you can set that between small, large, and medium. And unfortunately, this won't work with label, but it will work if you're using the image. But first of all, let's try that. We're gonna set the text first, and we're gonna put your name right below the first style. Let me set the font to .title. And if you want to set the weight, you can also do .weight right after .title to .semi-bold. And then we're going to set a third text. I'm going to put my location, which is Canada. For you, you can use your country. And then for the foreground color, I'm going to use secondary. Now for the second text, I'm going to set a symbol next to it. So command click on the text, embed in H tag, and right before the text, we're going to set image, parentheses, system name. Let's set it to location. So now we have this little location. And if I feel that the symbol is too big compared to the text, I can now use my modifier for image scale. So let me move that to my image here. So when I do that, you can see that the symbol is a lot smaller now, and I can set it to large, and it's going to be a lot bigger. So image scale is used for the proportion of your image versus the text next to it. And if you want to change the size, you would use the font size. Now you can see that SF symbol is really powerful, really customizable. Before we go, we're going to customize the padding a little bit. So for the VStack, we're going to set a spacing of 8, and then we're going to add a little bit of padding at the end. So I hope you love SF symbol as much as I do. And in the next session, we're going to learn how to set each of these items as navigation links so that we can navigate back and forth to subscreens and also use the URL. So I'll see you in the next session. Hello, and welcome to the 9th session of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to learn about navigation links and how to open URL to Safari and how to customize the list items a little bit more, including the accent color and buttons as well as the layout. First, let's go to the 3 items in our list here, and we're going to create a navigation for them. So we're going to scroll to the settings, and for the settings, we're going to command click on it, embed. Instead of container, we're going to set navigation link. With navigation link, we're going to set parentheses and we're going to select destination and label. The destination is where you want the button to go. And here we're going to set one of the two views that we have so far. And we're going to set the content view. The label is the content itself. So we can delete this because we already set that by using the curly braces. And once you have the navigation link set up, you're going to see this chevron here on the list item. And so you can tap on it. It's going to go to the view that you have set up so far. And so that is the content view. Now, the difference is when you have a list, you're going to see that it's going to set up the navigation bar and you're going to be able to navigate back and forth between the views. Now, there's a new way to write navigation link as well as buttons. And it's a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to command click on label. We're going to do exactly the same step. We're going to select embed, navigation link, and instead of setting the parentheses, sometimes you have to set the values such as destination and label, and sometimes those values can be conflicting with whatever you have in the curly braces after. So in this case, you don't have to think about it. You just need to set curly braces, and this is going to be your action, and then label column, and then this is going to be your content. Now, just the same way, I can set the content view, which is the destination, parentheses, and now my billing has the chevron, and I can navigate the same way. Where this gets a little bit cleaner as an alternative to writing it this way is when you want to start composing your action, so your destination in this case. So for example, instead of the content view itself, I can just set a text. And that's what a view is. Everything in here is a view, and my text is also a view. So I can set, let's say, billing. And now instead of going to the content view, it's simply going to set a new view with the text that says billing. So this is arguably a cleaner structure versus the parentheses, where it can get pretty crazy and you can have many values and you can compose your new layout in a cleaner way because it's on the same level as the label. And if your code here is short, you don't need to set the indentation, and it's going to look a little bit like the parentheses. Now let's do the same thing for the third item. Navigation link, curly braces, label, column, and then you have your label content. So this label structure is pretty consistent across the same type of wrapper, such as button, navigation link, and the same with the first curly braces. So we can set, let's say, content view in this case. All right, let's talk about the accent color. Oftentimes when you use a button or a navigation link, it's going to color the entire item. And if you want to customize that, what you can do is go to the item itself, such as a label, and set the accent color. By default, it's going to use the accent color that you have in your assets. But if you want to customize that, you can set the accent color on the item itself and set that to, let's say, primary. In this case, it's going to be black in light mode. One thing that is really cool about swiftUI is that, just like in CSS, the styles for the children elements will inherit from the parent. In this case, if I want to set the same accent color for all three items and not have to set the modifier for each, which is repetitive, I can just put this modifier on the parent itself. So for example, the section. And when I do that, it applies for all of the child elements. And this works as long as the elements can accept these modifiers. Now let's talk about linking to Safari. So in swiftUI, it's really easy to do that. And if you're not sure how to write each of these controls, you can always bring it from the library. So Shift, Command, and L, and you can find the link. So you have the navigation link. You also have the documentation on how to write them. Sometimes it can be confusing. So when you bring these elements, it gives you these placeholders and it's not going to give you errors in between. So that can be a little bit less scary for beginners. Now, by default, it's most likely going to set the normal way of writing the link and the navigation link, but you can always change that once you're comfortable with swiftUI. But first of all, let's start with the text content. We're going to change that to a label, and we're going to set again the title with the system image. It's going to be website, and I press tab to go to system image, set that to house, or the URL. Here we have a placeholder. It can be a little bit confusing. So what I can do is go to the documentation and kind of see how they write it. So this is where I need to explain what is going on. So here we have the URL, and then we're going to need to set a string, and within this string we have the URL itself, but then there's the exclamation point. Now let's try that. URL parentheses, and again, it can be confusing to have many options. Sometimes swiftUI doesn't do a good job at giving you the best suggestions. So that's why the documentation can be really helpful. And in this case, we're gonna have to find the string. And with a string, it's simply using quotes, and we can set the web address for, let's say, apple.com. Now here it's going to complain about optionals. If you've never done the Swift language before, this is going to be super confusing. So it's going to tell you it has to be unwrapped, and you can coalesce and force unwrap. It's really not friendly in terms of the English that is being used to explain these things. Now, essentially, the way I would explain it is that optional is used when the value that you're using may or may not be empty. And oftentimes when you deal with values that can change a lot, such as from an API or from the internet, Swift needs to be certain about these values. Otherwise, it cannot give you these amazing features such as the auto-completion, such as all of these code highlighting and beautiful suggestions. So here it tells you that you have one of two options. Typically, this basically says you need to set a default value, and we kind of learn a little bit about default values. Or when you enter these values manually, such as the Apple URL, and it doesn't come from a dynamic data, then you can force unwrap it by using the exclamation point. So I'm going to click fix here. It's going to add my exclamation point. And what this means is that I'm saying to Swift, I'm sure that this value will always be correct, would not be empty. And this is okay because I'm entering this value manually, and I can always test that. But it's always dangerous when you deal with dynamic data, API calls, and you set the exclamation point without default values, and it's going to crash your app if the value is not correct. So to summarize, some values in Swift will be optional just because they can change a lot, and sometimes they can be empty. But when you use some of these views, such as link, they absolutely want these values to not be optional, which is why we're using the exclamation point. And as long as you're sure that these values are good, then you may use the exclamation point. Otherwise, you can set something a little bit more complex that you will learn later on, such as default values or guard. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about optional, you can read the documentation. And here it gives you a pretty good example. You're going to learn a little bit more about Swift when you feel that you're ready. And there are definitely more ways to deal with optional, such as optional binding and a lot more. So now I want to set more than one item for my links. So I'm going to put this inside a section. Let's embed it first. Set a section. And also for my section, I'm going to set the accent color to primary. Now let's talk about how far you can customize your layout in a list. There are definitely limitations. And in fact, it's only recently that we could start customizing the separator in terms of the color. But it's important to note that the container itself is not very customizable, but the content is. So for example, if I set the background, and you don't have to follow me on this one, so I can set it to red, you can see that this link here, and this is how much space that it's taking. So anything that is inside the red background, I can customize everything. But the padding that I have for the list items, as well as the container style, is controlled by my list style, which I can set to plain or other types. Now let's try to add our own icon on the right side. So what we can do is command click on the label and put that inside an H tag, which is a horizontal stack. And then right after the label, we're going to bring an image, system name, and it's going to be link. Then if we want to take the entire horizontal space, we can use the spacer. Then I'm going to customize the color of my icons. So I'm going to set foreground color and set that to secondary. Now let me remove the red. So as you can see, I want to be consistent with the rest of the layout, with the icon on the left and then the secondary icon on the right, telling people that this is different from the chevrons, which goes to the subscreens, versus this is going to open in Safari. Now please note that your link is not going to be able to open in the preview in Xcode. So you will have to open this using the device itself or in the simulator. First of all, let's make sure that we have set whatever device that you want to preview this on, and then you can do Command R to build it. Once you build the app, you're going to see that it's going directly to the content view screen, and we can fix that by setting the default screen to another one. And so to do that, we're going to need to go to the main view, which is called the name of your app and app at the end. So you can see here that it's linking to content view by default, and we can change that to account view. Once that is done, then I can build again, and here I'm going to replace, you can say don't ask again, and there you go. So now if I test the link, you can see that it's going to open on Safari. Now let's go back to account view, and here whenever you run on the iOS simulator, it's also going to give you some of these logs, which is really helpful for debugging. You can always toggle that, and if you want to stop the simulator and focus back on the preview, we're going to click on stop. Then let me resume. So before we go, let's set a second link. I don't want to recode all of this stuff, so I'm going to copy and then paste a second link. Now let's change the second button to YouTube or whatever website that you want to set it. Feel free to customize anything that we have so far. So I'm just going to set to youtube.com, and the website is going to be YouTube TV for the system name. Then let's resume again, which has a shortcut that is Option Command P. And there you go. Let's just remove the list separator by setting dot list row separator visibility and set to dot hidden. And that's it. I hope you learned a lot about navigation links and URL, as well as a little bit about optional. Definitely look into the documentation and learn more about it. It's going to help you a lot down the line. But of course, if you just want to follow this course, you can just focus on building, and I think with practice, you're going to get there. So in the next session, we're going to learn about swipe actions, but also how to manage your states. I think it's going to be very interesting. So I'll see you in the next session. Welcome back to session 10 of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to learn about the new swipe actions in iOS 15. It's really easy and it's very powerful interaction that is very popular on apps like News as well as Mail. So for example, you can swipe this list item left or right to get to more buttons. And then we're going to learn about states, how to manage them, how to use them in order to show or hide an item. Let's begin by going to these two items and we're going to apply the swipe actions. Let's scroll down and here we're going to find the link. Now all you need to do is to use a new modifier called swipe actions. And we're going to use the content one, then press enter. This is going to create the curly braces and here we're going to set the button. Now for the button, we're going to bring that from the library. And it's super simple. It's a button with the action and then the content. So the swipe action can have an icon and you can use the image, but I like to use the label. Why? Because it's more accessible. And here I'm going to set the title with a system name. And when I say accessible, it means that I can set the name of the image on top of just using the system image, which would be, let's say, trash for delete. And so I'm going to set the text to delete. Later on, you're going to learn more about accessibility, but essentially, if you look at image, it only has the name of the icon itself versus label. You can customize the text that you want for voiceover, for example. So with this, we have enough and we can resume. And for the first item, which is the website, I can swipe from right to left to get to my swipe action. So that was pretty straightforward. I can swipe to the entire row, or I can just swipe a little bit and the button's going to be there and I can tap on it to dismiss and activate the action itself. Now you can see that the icon is from the label and it's using the SF symbol trash. If I want to customize the swipe action, I can go to the swipe actions modifier and set parentheses. And this is where I can set the second option. And now I have the edge allows full swipe and the content being whatever is inside the curly braces. So I can just remove that. Let's start with the edge. Press dot and you're going to find that you have two options. One is trailing and leading. So leading is left and trailing is from the right. So let's try leading. Allow full swipe is useful for deleting, for example. You want to be able to swipe the entire thing to be able to activate one of the buttons. So by default it's set to true, but I can set it to false. And if it's not active, then I can't swipe more than the limit, which is here, and it doesn't activate the button itself as you swipe. Versus if I set it to true, then I can full swipe and it doesn't wait for me to tap on the button to activate the button itself. Now, what about the color of the button? So what you can do is to use a modifier called .tint. And just like accent color, you can customize the entire button with tint. And here we're going to set it to red because it's for deleting. And when I do that, you can see that the entire button is red. So the difference between tint and accent color is that accent color is mostly for the general color that you use for text and buttons, but the tint will override that and will sometimes color the entire button itself. And of course, you can read more about it in the documentation. Now let's talk about states, because we want our button to do something when we delete. And the most obvious thing to do is to hide the entire item once the delete is activated. And to do that, it's pretty easy. First of all, we're going to need to set our states at the very beginning of our view. And so right after the first parentheses and before the body, we're going to set at state var is deleted. And notice that this is the naming convention for a Boolean. And a Boolean is basically true or false. And we're going to set to default false. So equal to false. Now, what is a state? This is a value that can change over time. It is especially useful for, let's say, animations, such as the beginning of the animation, the end of the animation, or if you want to show or hide content based on the tap of a button, or even increment a number when you tap a button. So the state is very useful for values that can change over time. In this case, we're going to use it so that when we tap on this button or we swipe, it's going to hide the entire row. So let's use that and go back here. Let me just hide the left navigator. Now, what I want to do is to wrap this link here and use embed. Then I'm going to replace container by if is deleted is equals to false. So double equal signs. Another way to write this, which is shorter, is to add an exclamation point in front of the Boolean. So in this case, it's the same thing, is equals to false. Next, we just need to set the action. So when this is being activated, I want to change that state. So for the button that says action, parentheses, in between set is deleted is equal to true when I activate this swipe. So here I'm changing my value, and this is a condition. So now when I swipe, it's going to hide the entire row. Next, I want to show you that you can add multiple buttons instead of just one for your swipe actions. First, we're going to need to indent this, and if you want to do that manually, or you can select the code Control I. For the second button, we're going to write it from scratch using the new way. So button, parentheses, and then label, and here I can press enter. It's going to create my parentheses for me. Now I'm going to set label with the title and system image. So this is going to be pin and then pin lowercase. Next, I'll change the tint to yellow this time. Now that I have two buttons, I can try to swipe, and here it seems that sometimes the preview can act, and in this case you can always stop and play again. And also you can just press space in the code. It's going to reset the states. So those are really useful techniques whenever you see that there's no change in your preview. So now I can try to swipe again. I can see that I have two buttons. Let me reset that. If I don't swipe the entire thing, I'm going to release, and then it's going to show me these two buttons. If I swipe the entire thing, it's going to go to the delete option and apply that delete action. So let's try the other way. I tap here, it doesn't do anything because my button that is yellow doesn't have an action. But if I tap on the delete, it's going to apply the action for the delete, which is changing the is deleted state. And then when this change the states, then using this condition, it's going to hide my entire row. Now, before we go a little bit deeper in the next session, I want to show you how to toggle the states and also how to organize so that your code is going to be much more readable. And also we're going to be able to reuse some of these buttons locally instead of having to create a new view and use that across the entire app. Sometimes you want to create these elements that is only going to be used inside a single view. And that's what we're going to learn in the next session. So I'll see you then. Hello, and welcome to session 11 of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to learn about structuring our code, making it a little bit more readable locally, and then we can learn about toggling our states so that we can go deeper with the swipe actions. First of all, let's take a look at the structure of our code. We have the main view, and then we have the states. Then we have the body, and the body typically contains the entire UI of your screen. Now in your body, we're wrapping everything inside a navigation view so that we can use the title and the navigation to the subscreens back and forth. Then we have the list, and the list is allowing us to set a layout that is using rows and sections, as well as the swipe actions. Now in our code, you can see that we have three main sections. And when you have a lot of code like this, it can be really daunting to find yourself. So one thing that you can do is to put each of these sections into its own local component. So the difference is going to be that we're going to have access to the same states. We won't need to have to create a new view, and we don't really plan to use these local components anywhere else than in this view. So for example, I don't anticipate to reuse this section or these links anywhere else in the app. In order to do that, I'm going to select the VStack, which is the first element right after the list. So let's double click on the curly braces and let's select the modifiers plus the VStack and do Command X to cut. If you do that, you're going to see that the first section is removed from the preview. And then we're going to create a new local component. So let's double click on the curly braces of the body. That's going to give us the end of that body. And right after, we're going to set var profile of type SumView curly braces. So notice that this is the same structure as the body. And instead of saying body, we're naming it profile. And then inside the curly braces, we're going to paste the content. Another advantage of doing this is to avoid what we call the pyramid of doom. This is when you have a lot of if statement, a lot of indentation, and it makes it super hard to read because it's going to keep pushing the code, and then you're going to need a bigger screen to be able to see everything, and then the text goes to the next line, and it's just very, very difficult to read. So you want to avoid that, especially when you see something like this where you have one structure, a second level, and a third level. So you want to put that at the basic level and it becomes easier to read. Now that we have created our local component, we can reference that where it was. So profile, and then you're going to find it here. Now let's do that for the next one, which is section. Cut that. And we're going to create a new one after profile. So var menu of type SumView, and then paste that code. Let's go back and put menu. Next, we're going to set the third section. This is going to be called links. And we're going to go right after menu, var links of type SumView, and then paste that. So once that is done, then your body is going to be super easy to read. And when I resume, then I have exactly the same layout as before. The goal for your code is so that you can quickly glance at the structure and see what's going on very quickly. You want to be able to avoid the pyramid of doom so that it's easier to read in a smaller screen. And finally, since it's a local component, you can use these local states and you don't need to pass values, and you don't really need to reuse these local components anywhere else than in this account view. Now with that done, we're going to set our pin action so that this time we're going to change to another button. So when we tap on pin, it's going to go and change the button to unpin. To do that, we're going to set another state. So state var is pin is equal to false by default. Let's go to the links, and this is where organizing your code can be super useful, especially when you have not just the body, but also the profile and other sections. You can go to the breadcrumb here, and you can see that we don't have just the body, we're also showing the different states, but also you can navigate very quickly to the links, and it's gonna go directly there. And now you find your code. All right, let's go to the button that has pin. Here for the action of that button, we're going to change our state, but this time we want to switch back and forth between false and true. And in order to do that, we can do isPin which is the state that we have declared, dot toggle. So the difference with this versus this one is that isDeleted will always go to true when you tap the delete button. But when you toggle, it's going to switch back and forth between true or false. And this is good when you want to activate and deactivate, and you can do that indefinitely. Now, while this state is changing, we're not using that state. So let's use that state so that we can change the label and the system image to something else. We're going to use the condition. So if is pin curly braces, we're going to set a label with a title, and this time is going to say unpin. The system image is going to be pin.slash. And then, since we're using the if statement, you can also have the else, which means otherwise. And then we're going to put the label right here inside the second curly braces. As a result of all of this code, we're going to resume, and then we're going to swipe. Now, when I tap here, it's going to dismiss, but when I swipe again, it's going to change that icon. And remember that while we're using the condition this way here to change between different views, we can also do the same for the modifiers, but using the other technique, which is we're going to ask the question, is this pin? Question mark. If yes, we're going to set to gray. Otherwise, so using the column, it's going to be yellow by default. So let's try that. Yellow by default. Tap that. Come back again, becomes gray. Tap that, becomes yellow, and back and forth. And that's what the toggle is all about. Next, I want to show you that your local components can also be reusable, just like a normal component. So let's say we want to use this button in multiple places, and this is for the pinning. And I'm going to cut this first. Then right after the links, so double click here, and I know where the end lies. Here I'm going to set var pin button. I can definitely be more specific with these local components, especially if I don't want to conflict with other names. But since it's a local component, you can get away with not being too specific because this button is not shared across the entire app, so you don't need to worry too much about conflicting names. But it definitely doesn't hurt to be more specific because it makes your code more readable. And in this case, I'm going to set pin button of type SumView, curly braces, and paste that button. Now notice that this button is using the local state is pin, so that's another advantage of a local component. You don't need to pass those states. And finally, we're going to reference that button to pin button here after the first one. And we can even set a swipe action for the YouTube link. So dot swipe actions. And here I'm going to set pin button, resume, and then you can see that I can swipe. It does exactly the same as the other one right here. So I hope you found that useful. In the next session, I want to show you about the new canvas where you can create graphics that are very inexpensive when it's animated. I think this is going to be a treat to designers and developers. So I hope to see you in the next session. Hey there, welcome to session 12 of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to learn about the new Canvas API in iOS 15. Now, when you implement the different elements of your app, such as the background, the assets, and the animations, you have a few options, including exporting to SVG, to PDF, to PNG, JPEG. You can do that layer by layer, or you can do that in code. The most effortless way to implement your backgrounds or your assets is to merge everything and set that as a background, but then you can't really animate each of those layers to create maybe a parallax effect. The same for these blobs, you wouldn't be able to animate them separately. Now, everything that is part of the UI, such as the text, the container, the effects, should be done in swiftUI. But what about the graphics? such as the blobs and these little waves and mountains. Sure, you can export them to PDF one by one, but then you're going to be faced with problems such as the file size, the performance, and also it's really hard to program some of these animations. So that's where Canvas comes in. Canvas is great with performance. Because it removes all of the interactivity, then you gain performance and you also have more control over the path, which is what makes a vector. So if I press enter here, you can see that all of these are Bezier curves and all of these can translate to path in Swift, or for SVG, then you have the SVG code for that vector. Furthermore, you also have these SF symbol that are also vectors. They're fun icons, but you can also use them as vectors and you can decide to animate them in Canvas. So that's going to be really interesting. Let's head back to Xcode and let's play with the Canvas API. First of all, we're going to create a new file. So Command N and create a new swiftUI view. I'm going to name this hexagon view. Let's resume this and we're going to start with the basics. This is how you would do it using just swiftUI without Canvas. But to do it in Canvas, we're going to first delete the text element, and we can start with simply finding from the views in the library something called Canvas. Double click on it and it's going to create our placeholder. Now the Canvas is a simple wrapper that gives us the context and the size. The context allows us to draw our graphics, and the size gives the size of the actual canvas, which right now is like a shape which takes all available space. Inside the canvas, you can draw and compose multiple things such as text, vectors, images, and even the SF symbol. Let's start with a simple one, which is the text. Let's do context.draw parentheses, and here you're going to find multiple options to do so. Now you have the image, you have the text, and then you have the symbol. Then secondly, you have inRect, which is what holds the position as well as the size together. And also you have @point, which is a value that holds the position. So when I say position, I mean the X and Y position. And when I mean the size, I mean the width and the height. So let's scroll down a little bit and you're going to find something that says text @. So that's the simplest one. And double click on it. We're going to get the placeholder. The text is going to use the text element. So text, parentheses, let's say design code. And as I mentioned before, this is the value that holds the X and Y position. So you can just press enter and using the CG point, parentheses, and then you have the auto completion for the value X and Y. So X and Y, if you're a designer, if you work with design tools, you know that this is where the position starts. So let's set that to 0, 0. And there you go, we have design code, and it seems that we need to push that a little bit more, so we can do 20, 20. Then let's resume, and it's pushing a little bit more. Maybe we can try 50 and resume again. Now you're probably gonna ask me, well, why should I do this in the canvas versus in the swiftUI view instead? Well, the advantage here is that you can compose that as a graphic and you're gonna get a performance gain, especially when you're gonna start animating all of these layers. So think of the whole canvas as an animate asset that is very performant. And typically you're not really gonna use the text element. You're more going to compose a bunch of vectors. So that's exactly what we're gonna do. So let's add another context. And this time we're going to draw a vector. And we can use .fill or .stroke. The stroke is the border and the fill is gonna fill the vector. Now I'm gonna set .fill, parentheses, and I'm gonna use the one that says width. So press enter, and here I need to set a path. A path, like I mentioned before, is what draws the vector using points. So let's set the value, path, parentheses, and here we have a bunch of options. We're going to use the one that says ellipses in, and the CGRect, like I mentioned before, it's what holds the position and the size. So press enter, parentheses, we're going to initialize that, and now we have 4 values, including the X value, the Y value, the width, and the height. So let's start with 100, 100. For the shading, this is where you can control the color or the gradient. In this case, we're going to use dot color. Inside the parentheses, we're going to set dot pink. So now I have created a circle that is 100 by 100 at position 0, 0, using the CGRect that combines all of these values. And you can see that I can compose my different layers the way I want by using the different positioning. Now, what about bringing an asset? So let's do that. We're going to use context again. And this time we're going to use dot draw, parentheses. And here we're going to use image. And we're going to select the one that says CGRect so that we can control all of these values. All right, the image, just like the text, it's the same as swiftUI, and we're going to use image parentheses, and this time it's going to be the name of the image. Let's try blob1, which is part of our library. So you can see here we have a bunch of these images. We just need to find the right name, and here we have blob1. And then again, CGRect, we're going to set the positioning 0, 0, and then let's say 200 by 200. So now we have our asset. So you can see in our canvas, we can have multiple types of elements, such as the text, a vector, and an image. But since we can use an image, what is interesting is that we can actually use an SF symbol as well. So context.draw, parentheses, again, I'm going to use the image in CGRect, and we're going to use image parentheses, system name, quotes, hexagon, and in CGRect parentheses, initialize, let's say 100, 100, 200, 200. So you can see that this is using the SF symbol. And if I go to my SF symbol, I can search for the different shape. You can also go to this tab here. You can see that we can bring a number of shapes. And if I use the hexagon, it's the outline one. And if I use hexagon.fill, I'm going to get the fill one. So .fill and resume. There you go. We have the fill one. Now you can see that each of these layers, you can control the position and the size freely, and you're composing everything inside the canvas. But you can also use the size. So if you want to take the entire size, which adapts to the screen itself, you can use that value and put, let's say, size.width, and then you can see that I'm getting the width of the canvas itself, size.height, and the height of the canvas. If I set X position 0 and Y position 0, then it's going to go back to the original position starting from the top left. It is important to understand that when I use these elements that are also available in swiftUI, I can use the same modifiers. So for example, if I want to use .font, .large title, then it's going to work. But I cannot use a modifier on the context. As you can see, nothing is available. But I can use a modifier on the canvas. So for example, if I want to restrict the frame size of my canvas to, let's say, frame, width of 200, height of 220, and we don't need the alignment, then I can do so and think of the entire canvas as an asset. And so I'm setting the frame of that asset to 200 by 220. And I can also color the entire asset by using .foreground style, and I can use .red. So it's going to color all of the inner elements of my canvas. And likewise, I can use the linear gradients using the color values. So the colors array, we're going to start with pink, comma, and then dot blue. Start point, top leading, end point, bottom trailing. So now we have the gradient applied to all the elements. Next, I want to show you that sometimes it's really hard to tell what is the size of each of these symbols. So for example, the hexagon, how do I know that it's a width of this much against a height of this much to get the proper proportion? So a quick trick is to go to Figma, and let's say we're going to go to Assets. And here we can bring any of the SF symbol, but let's say we're going to bring the hexagon. So first of all, I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to set T to get the font. I'm going to paste that. Now it is important to make sure that you have SF Pro, display or text, doesn't matter, but essentially this allows you to use any of the SF symbols as a font. Therefore, it's going to work properly in the design tool. So I'm going to set to 200 in terms of font size. And again, you don't really know the actual size because we have a frame and it's centered within it. So one thing you can do is to right click and then do outline stroke. And there are equivalents to that in different design tools. But once you do that, you can press enter, and now we have all of the vector points. And if you want to resize that to get the proper dimension, you can press on Shift while resizing the element. And let's say we're going to get to width 200. So you can see that at the end, we get 200 by 212. Then in next code, we're going to change the height to 212 and then resume. Now we get the perfect proportion for the SF symbol. It is possible that you're going to get slight variations in terms of the proportion, and that depends on the font size that you set it. And you should definitely play with the different SF symbols, many at once, and compose your own canvas in Xcode. I think you're going to have a lot of fun with that. Now you can see that the Canvas API is really powerful, but we're only getting started. In fact, you can mostly do the same if you were to use a view in swiftUI. But later on, when we're going to start animating and using paths to create vectors, you're going to see the many advantages to using Canvas. Before we go, we can definitely use this canvas as part of the account view. And so we're going to go to Profile and then jump there. Now we're going to find the background that has the hexagon. So we can replace that with the canvas. Now you can see that we have the image here. We have the symbol variant, the color, and the font that we don't need anymore. So all of these can be replaced by hexagon view parentheses. And now you can see that this is my canvas that I just created with all of those elements. In the next session, I want to show you how to turn an SVG into path in Swift so that we can use that in Canvas and eventually animate that. So I'll see you in the next session.